Hello, and welcome back to another episode of It's Fine. So, if you've taken any sort of basic philosophy class, you have probably heard of the trolley problem. If you don't know what this is a very well known thought experiment that seems to be discussed a lot in basic philosophy classes. I'm pretty sure that this was discussed in an intro to philosophy class that I took in college. So basically, this thought experiment asks the question: if five people were tied to the tracks of a trolley, and there was a trolley coming down the tracks that cannot be stopped, but if you pull a lever and divert the trolley onto a different set of tracks, it will hit one person tied to those tracks. What should you do? And English philosopher Philippa Foot is credited with introducing this thought experiment in 1967, while philosopher Judith Thomson is credited with coining the term trolley problem. So basically, this thought experiment shows the distinction between two different concepts of morality. The first is the utilitarian philosophy, which basically states that we should choose the action that will have the best overall consequence. So, under this sort of type of morality, most people would pull the lever because they would argue that the best overall consequence would be for one person to be hit by the trolley versus five people to be hit by the trolley. But the other is the idea of adhering to strict values and beliefs. So, for example, if somebody believes that they should not actively murder someone, they may not pull the lever because to them, pulling the lever would cause them to be the reason why the one person on the other set of tracks was run over. Now, this does beg the question, do you believe inaction is a form of action? Because some people argue that there really isn't any sense of inaction. And inaction is something that doesn't really exist because if you choose not to do something, that is a choice and therefore action. Other people may argue that if you don't pull the lever, you're passively letting five people be hit by a trolley. And, you know, some people would argue that that would happen whether you were there or not. So you not pulling the lever doesn't really change the situation and you're not responsible for that. Some people still may argue, well, you're still responsible for those five people being hit by a trolley because you could have pulled the lever and you could have saved them. That gets a little bit tricky. But basically, this situation is difficult to determine a solid answer for. Now, in my experience, I feel like people answer this differently very often, but a lot of people seem to come up with their answer very quickly and confidently as well. However, I would point out that it's very questionable if people would actually act as they say. Because, think about it. There are so many people who say that they would do one thing in a situation and then they are put in that pretty similar situation and they don't actually act in the way that they say that they would. There is a YouTube channel called Vsauce that conducted an experiment where people were basically thinking that they were in this situation. Like the experiment was designed in a way where people basically thought that they were in the trolley problem in real life. It's absolutely wild. It's very interesting to watch. And I think it's so interesting that they took a classic thought experiment and were able to design like a real life experiment, or at least as close as you could get to real life, because they obviously did not have people tied to the tracks of a trolley. People did not get hurt in this experiment. The other point is as well, I've heard people alter the situation to see how people's opinions would change. So for example, I've heard people change the situation where instead of just five random people and one random person, they would ask, okay, if it was five random people, random strangers, tied to one set of the tracks, and then on the other set of the tracks, it was one of your family members, what would you do? And a lot of people who say that they would pull the lever change their tune very quickly, and they're like, oh no, well, I wouldn't pull the lever because I'm going to save my family member. So that changes their decision. Also, if you really think about it, I feel like there are so many other factors that go along with this. Like, if you were actually put in that situation, I feel like a lot of people probably would, like, get super anxious, and rightfully so. They would probably panic, and I feel like that panic may cause an action because a lot of people freeze whenever they panic, or vice versa. It may cause somebody to pull the lever out of sheer panic. I mean, you don't really know. Like, I feel like you don't fully know how you're going to act in a certain situation until you're actually put in that situation. There's a lot of nuance in decision making that some people don't account for whenever they talk about hypotheticals in general. And, you know, it kind of makes you wonder, is there really like a universal correct decision in general? Like, not only for the trolley problem, but just like for certain situations in life in general. Like, I'm sure there are some things that we can agree are right and wrong. Like, the vast majority of people would agree that certain things are right and certain things are wrong in this life. But I will say that a large majority of things in this world are not black and white problems. They're not black and white situations. There is so much nuance to every decision that we make, and every decision does have some form of consequence. So, I have been seeing a lot about the butterfly effect recently on social media. So, if you don't know what the butterfly effect is, actually, technically, according to Britannica, it is the idea in chaos theory that describes how small changes to a complex system's initial conditions can produce dramatically different outcomes, and it was most prominently researched by meteorologist Edward Lorenz in the early 1960s. So, the butterfly effect actually is about weather, but, pop culture got its hands on this concept, and now it has gained prominence in pop culture to discuss how seemingly small actions or decisions can have large effects. So basically, people online are sharing their stories about how they made one seemingly small decision that had large impacts on their lives. And a lot of times they talk about like small decisions that had what seemed to be large impacts on their lives that like were unrelated, if that makes sense. Like, the small change that they made had a unrelated large impact, or at least what you would think would be unrelated, but it ended up actually being related. Like, I remember one person, for example, made the point that their parents wanted them to transfer colleges, but if they would have done that, they would have never met their husband, right? And in the moment, you wouldn't think about that. You wouldn't think, oh, well, I shouldn't transfer because I'm going to meet my future husband, right? I will say some people online are claiming that the butterfly effect is just divine intervention. That all depends what you believe in terms of religion. Some people believe in predeterminism, which if you believe that, then technically I would argue that you would believe that we make no decisions at all, because that belief system believes that everything is predetermined in life. Some people do believe in fate. Other people believe in free will. For the sake of this podcast, I'm looking at all of this under the lens that we have complete and total free will. Which, if I do look at it that way, to me, the butterfly effect is real because it just points out that every action has a consequence. And I agree that sometimes it's wild that like small actions seem to have like huge effects on our lives that we may never have been able to predict. But I do think this theory reminds us how intentional and mindful we need to be about decision making in our lives. And this idea is beautifully illustrated in the book Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, I think is how you say his last name. I'm sorry if that's wrong. So I'm going to try and not say too much about this book in an attempt to not spoil it for you. But in the book, it's about a character named Jason who is kidnapped by a different version of himself trying to steal his life. And in the book, there is a different version of himself that is basically created at every point in his life where he could make a decision, leading to a multiverse of different versions of himself in his life. And I remember reading this in high school. I thought it was a great book. I think they turned it into like a movie or a TV show. I don't remember. But basically, I feel like this book reminds us that our lives could be totally different based on the decisions that we make. Every decision that we make does have some sort of consequence. And if we make a different decision, then that would have a different consequence, thus changing our life. And sometimes it can be very, very small. Like if I decide to go eat a snack, I will probably feel fuller. Like that decision has a consequence. That might be a very small consequence. But, if I decide to get married, that has a bigger consequence, right? Because now I am married. Now I am like legally married to someone else. Now, I want to talk about the idea about there being good and bad decisions. Again, like I kind of said earlier, I feel like we could argue that there are some good and some bad decisions in life. But I think sometimes there is much more nuance to life than people give the world credit for, especially when it comes to how we want to live our lives. So, a good example of what I'm trying to talk about is there's this movie on Netflix called Look Both Ways. I think it's a Netflix original, but I'm not entirely sure. But it follows the character Natalie on the night that she takes a pregnancy test. And it shows you what her life would look like if the pregnancy test was positive and if the pregnancy test was negative. You could argue that both of these lives are not bad ones. Like they're still arguably both good lives. They're just vastly different. And this is what I mean. Like a lot of decisions in life do change your life and they do have consequences, but because there's so much nuance to them, it's hard to argue if they were good or bad. Like it's almost like you can't argue if they are good or bad until you see the consequence of the action. And then it depends on what you want in life. And obviously, I'm being extremely general here for the sake of this podcast. But a lot of times, it also depends on how we frame the situation in our minds. So, for example, say you're in a bad romantic relationship and, it's bad, but you stay too long in the relationship. But you end up breaking up and you end up being fine in the end. One person could argue, oh, I deeply regret staying in that relationship because I wasted so much time. Whereas another person could reframe the exact same situation and look at it as a blessing. They could look at it in a way that, okay, that situation was arguably very bad. But because I went through that situation, I learned what I want in a relationship. I learned what to look for in a future relationship. And I learned a lot about myself. And therefore, in my next relationship, I will be a better partner. Even though the situations were the same, one person could look at it as being a bad decision, where another person could look at it as essentially having a net positive outcome. And you could argue it was a good decision to stay that long in this bad relationship. Again, it kind of depends on the consequence, and it depends on how the person frames that consequence in their mind as to whether or not a decision was arguably good or bad. And there's so much nuance in the fact that, it depends on, what happens to that person. It depends on what they want out of life. There are a ridiculous amount of different factors that goes into this. And again, I understand that I'm being, so extremely general right now because I kind of have to be. Again, I feel like there are certain things in life that we can all argue. At least the vast majority of us would agree are probably good decisions and bad decisions, right? I'm sure there are definitely some things that the majority of us could agree upon. But for the rest of it, I feel like a lot of it's up to you. As long as you're, not hurting yourself or other people. The argument of if something is good or bad is mostly up to you. And we're faced with decisions every single day in life. And sometimes we make the arguably right choice, and sometimes we make the arguably wrong choice. And sometimes, which is what I'm kind of alluding to, sometimes there's no right or wrong choice. Sometimes there's just choices, and we get to decide what choice we feel that we should make. Because, we can only really make one choice, and we don't really know what the consequence of the other choice was going to be a lot of the times. And it makes me wonder, like, if life is just essentially one big trolley problem, where we're just trying to make the most of our circumstances with the knowledge that we have at any given moment, and we're just trying to make what we think is the best decision. But, of course, at the end of the day, whatever the case may be, it's fine.